It all began on a seemingly ordinary spring morning, the kind that made suburban life feel predictable and comfortably quiet. The birds chirped in synchronized rhythm as the sun cast soft golden light across manicured lawns, and neighbors busied themselves with weekend routines, unaware of the storm that was about to shake the neighborhood to its core. He had been planning a modest landscaping project for months, having carefully submitted a request to the HOA for reimbursement according to the community bylaws. The plans had been approved, the funds allocated, and yet when the contractor finished planting the roses, trimming the hedges, and installing the small stone pathway, the reimbursement never arrived. The promised check seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving him staring at a beautifully transformed yard while the HOA remained silent. Letters and emails sent to the board yielded nothing beyond vague excuses and bureaucratic redirection, each response more frustrating than the last. It was as if the HOA president had mastered the art of disappearing responsibility, of diverting accountability into corners too convoluted to navigate. At first, he tried to rationalize the delay, reminding himself that mistakes happen and that people get busy. But when weeks turned into months with no progress and no explanation, suspicion took root. He began poring over past OA records, scrutinizing minutes of meetings, expense reports, and financial statements, searching for clues in every line and footnote. What he uncovered was a tangled web of mismanagement. Funds labeled for community projects appeared to have been redirected, sometimes multiple times, to vague accounts or payments for services that were never rendered. Certain invoices were missing signatures, others contained amounts that did not match contracts, and some checks appeared to have been cashed without any clear record of who authorized them. He realized with growing unease that the problem wasn't a simple administrative error, it was systemic. The more he dug, the more discrepancies he found. It became increasingly clear that the HOA president had either ignored rules he was sworn to enforce or had deliberately misused the community's funds. At that moment, a quiet determination settled over him, stronger than the frustration that had fueled his initial investigation. He understood that this wasn't just about reimbursement, it was about accountability, about holding a figure of authority responsible for mismanagement that affected every resident. But he also realized that conventional complaints and polite letters would achieve nothing against someone who wielded power like a shield. He needed to act strategically, and he needed to leverage the bylaws themselves, the very rules the HOA president relied upon to maintain control. Over the following days, he immersed himself completely in the HOA governing documents. Every paragraph, clause, and subsection was dissected with painstaking care. He compared approved budgets with actual expenditures, matched contractor invoices with board meeting approvals, and highlighted inconsistencies that revealed patterns of negligence. Slowly, a strategy began to form. He would use their own rules to his advantage, creating a situation where any attempt to dismiss or ignore his claims would only make the HOA more vulnerable. He started documenting everything, photographing contracts, copying receipts, and assembling a comprehensive timeline that connected his landscaping reimbursement to broader financial irregularities. As he compiled evidence, he noticed something remarkable. The HOA bylaws were not merely guidelines. They were a legal framework that, if applied correctly, could protect homeowners and expose misuse. Each time the president tried to obscure an expenditure or delay a decision, he realized there was a countermeasure in the bylaws to challenge it. That knowledge fueled a quiet excitement, a realization that the very tools used to control residents could now be turned against the board. Meanwhile, word of his investigation began to spread discreetly through the neighborhood. Casual conversations over fences and mailboxes hinted at growing curiosity and concern among other homeowners who had long suspected mismanagement but lacked proof. He sensed that his findings would resonate, that the frustration he felt was not unique, and that the moment to act might soon extend beyond a personal dispute into a community-wide issue. Yet he remained cautious, knowing that premature exposure could give the board time to cover tracks or retaliate. For now, preparation was everything. He spent evenings at his desk, lit only by a desk lamp, meticulously cross-referencing accounts and noting violations. Each discovery brought a mix of anger and vindication. The realization that the president had assumed immunity and that he was about to challenge it in the most methodical way possible. When he finally stepped back to view the pile of documents and evidence, he felt a surge of both anticipation and unease. The project that began as a simple landscaping reimbursement had transformed into a potential legal confrontation, a situation where the balance of power could shift dramatically. He could almost picture the board's reaction, the frustration and denial that would inevitably follow once he deployed the evidence strategically. And yet, there was no fear, only clarity. He understood that he was armed not with aggression or hostility, but with knowledge, documentation, and a plan grounded in the HOA own governing rule. The yard outside gleamed under the morning sun, a testament to patience, precision, and persistence, and it had become the symbol of the struggle that was about to unfold. Thold, this quiet, manicured space, once a personal project, now represented leverage, strategy, and the promise of exposure. It was the beginning of a battle that would go far beyond flowers, stone paths, or shrubs. It was the beginning of a confrontation that could upend the very authority of the HOA itself. Chapter 2 would see the first steps taken to challenge the board, using the bylaws as weapons and setting the stage for a legal unraveling that no one in the neighborhood could ignore. The moment to act arrived quietly, with no grand announcement, no fanfare, only the subtle click of a printer, and the rustle of papers being organized into neat stacks. He had spent weeks compiling evidence, cross-referencing contracts, invoices, meeting minutes, and budget allocations, and now every piece of information was ready to be weaponized. The first move had to be precise, deliberate, and legally airtight because a single misstep could allow the HOA president to dismiss the claim, hide behind bureaucratic loopholes, or retaliate against him personally. Early one morning, he began by sending a formal written request to the board, citing specific sections of the HOA bylaws that guaranteed reimbursement for approved projects. He referenced dates, approval numbers, and documented communications, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The letter was calm in tone but uncompromising in its intent, each paragraph meticulously structured to demonstrate that the HOA president's failure to pay was not only a breach of procedure but a violation of the community's governing documents. He included copies of every approval notice, contract, and receipt, ensuring that the board could not claim ignorance or misplacement of records. Alongside the letter, he submitted a detailed financial comparison showing discrepancies between what was approved in the annual budget and what had actually been paid out, with particular attention to his landscaping allocation. The comparison revealed patterns of misuse that could not be overlooked, not only exposing the denial of his reimbursement, but also hinting at larger financial mismanagement that would be difficult for the board to explain. The reaction, when it came, was immediate and telling. The HOA president responded with vague excuses, claiming clerical errors and lost paperwork, and attempted to redirect the conversation toward minor compliance issues that had nothing to do with the approved landscaping. Yet each response was carefully documented by him, adding to the growing record of the board's evasiveness. He knew that every attempt to deflect or delay would serve as additional evidence in the broader case he was constructing. As he waited for their next response, he began to explore additional sections of the bylaws that could be used strategically. Certain clauses allowed homeowners to demand independent audits, call emergency meetings, and question expenditures publicly. Other sections mandated transparency and penalties for non-compliance, giving him multiple avenues to escalate the matter. By the time the second week of correspondence passed, it became clear that the board was growing uneasy. Their initial confidence, rooted in years of unchecked authority, had begun to falter as the homeowner's requests became more detailed, formal, and backed by legal references. It was subtle at first, hesitations in language, delayed replies, and minor errors in their own records. But he recognized these as cracks, evidence that his methodical approach was having an impact. Around the neighborhood, the ripples of the dispute began to spread. Conversations that once revolved around trivial complaints now carried undertones of suspicion toward the HOA leadership. Neighbors mentioned seeing unusual financial patterns, unexplained fees, and past instances where reimbursements or approvals had been denied or delayed. While most had not acted on these observations before, The evidence he was amassing lent credibility to their suspicions. He realized that the dispute could evolve from a personal grievance into a catalyst for broader scrutiny of the board's operations. This prospect was both exciting and daunting, requiring careful consideration of timing, strategy, and public perception. With each passing day, he refined his approach, ensuring that his actions were not impulsive but deliberate, balancing legal leverage with tactical patience. He began to draft a plan for public presentation, considering how to bring the findings to the homeowners in a way that would compel attention, scrutiny, and support without seeming vindictive. The yard, already a visual testament to his patience and effort, became a symbol of accountability. Each perfectly trimmed hedge, every vibrant flower, and the meticulously laid stone pathway were no longer just aesthetic choices. They were evidence of compliance, proof that his project met all requirements, and a tangible representation of the discrepancy between what the HOA promised and what they delivered. Behind the scenes, he also researched previous board decisions, uncovering patterns of favoritism, unexplained contract approvals, and inconsistencies in spending. Each discovery added layers to his growing dossier, and he began to see a broader narrative emerge. The denial of his landscaping reimbursement was not an isolated incident, but part of a recurring pattern of mismanagement. By the end of the second week, he had not only formally challenged the denial, but also laid the foundation for a comprehensive legal and procedural case. His next steps would involve leveraging community support, escalating the request through official HOA channels, and preparing for the eventual confrontation that would expose the board's vulnerabilities. As he organized his documents late one evening, reviewing the timeline of approvals and payments under the warm glow of a desk lamp, he felt a quiet sense of anticipation. What had started as a personal dispute over a landscaping budget was now a carefully orchestrated campaign that could upend the authority of the HOA president and reveal the true state of the community's finances. And as he looked out at his yard, the evidence of his project glistening under the fading light, he realized that Chapter 3 would mark the moment when the confrontation moved from paperwork into action, where strategy would meet the reality of exposing the board. And the stakes would rise far beyond a simple reimbursement. By the time the third week arrived, the tension in the neighborhood had begun to shift from quiet suspicion to active curiosity as whispers of the homeowner's investigation traveled along fences, sidewalks, and over mailboxes. The initial correspondence with the board had already created unease within the HOA leadership, and the mounting evidence in his possession only intensified their anxiety. He had spent countless hours analyzing spreadsheets, cross-referencing invoices, and documenting every irregularity. And now the next phase was to expose the broader implications of what he had discovered. It was no longer merely a matter of a missing landscaping reimbursement. The pattern of financial mismanagement, favoritism in contract awards, and misallocation of community funds became the central narrative he was carefully constructing. He began preparing a detailed dossier, organizing each discrepancy into categories with timelines, amounts, and references to specific bylaws. Photographs of his completed landscaping project were included as proof of compliance, contrasting sharply with the delays, excuses, and obfuscation from the board. He understood that visuals carried a powerful weight and that the juxtaposition of his meticulously maintained yard with the board's failures would resonate with residents. Alongside the dossier, he drafted a summary intended for the community, concise, factual, and backed by evidence, designed to be easily understood by homeowners with little legal experience yet difficult for the board to dispute. The intent was clear: to empower the neighborhood to recognize mismanagement and consider its implications for the broader community. While he worked, subtle signs of the board's unease became apparent. The president began issuing more cautious memos, often vague and poorly constructed, betraying a level of nervousness previously unseen. Certain board members who had once supported the president began avoiding correspondence and meetings, a quiet acknowledgement that the homeowner's methodical approach had disrupted their authority. At this stage, it became clear that timing would be crucial. A premature public exposure could allow the board to attempt cover-ups, while waiting too long risked losing momentum. He devised a multi-step approach. First, direct engagement with the board using the evidence to compel a formal explanation. Second, documentation of any evasive or non-compliant behavior. And finally, a controlled release of key findings to the community, ensuring transparency while protecting himself from retaliation. Each step was calculated, each action deliberate. He began by requesting an emergency review of all financial allocations connected to community projects, citing the relevant bylaws that mandated transparency and accountability. The request was firm, professional, and unyielding, leaving little room for procedural evasion. When the board attempted to deflect with minor excuses or delayed responses, he documented each interaction, noting timestamps, emails, and any inconsistencies in their reply. It became a meticulous exercise in accountability, and each record strengthened his position for the eventual community presentation. Around him, the neighborhood began to stir with subtle interest. As word of the formal submission spread discreetly through the neighborhood, subtle signs of interest began to emerge. Neighbors who had long suspected financial mismanagement began quietly reviewing their own records, uncovering delays, missing reimbursements, and unexplained charges that mirrored the homeowner's findings. It became increasingly clear that the confrontation was no longer an isolated dispute. It was the spark that threatened to illuminate systemic issues within the HOA. The board, sensing the growing scrutiny, attempted to regain control by issuing formal statements to residents, emphasizing routine procedures and insisting on procedural propriety, but the homeowner's evidence undermined each claim, highlighting inconsistencies and omissions in the board's own records. Tension escalated further during the first in-person review meeting, where the homeowner presented the dossier before the full board. Each discrepancy, each missing or misallocated dollar was laid bare, the presentation methodical and unyielding. The board members, once confident and authoritative, now appeared uncertain, their expressions betraying a level of discomfort they had never experienced before. The president, confronted with evidence of direct violation of bylaws, attempted to interject, but the homeowner remained composed, referencing specific sections of the governing documents that allowed residents to demand transparency and accountability. With each page turned, the board's ability to respond diminished, their defenses eroded by the clarity of evidence and the homeowner's unwavering command of procedural rules. Meanwhile, the homeowner documented every response, every hesitation, and every failed attempt to deflect responsibility, understanding that these interactions themselves would become part of the growing body of evidence demonstrating systemic negligence. Outside the boardroom, the community began to take notice. Casual conversations over fences, whispers across driveways, and subtle nods in passing revealed that homeowners were beginning to connect the dots between their own frustrations and the meticulously documented evidence now circulating. The homeowner recognized the power of perception. Even without public announcements, awareness was spreading, and the board could feel the shift in authority. The confrontation intensified as the homeowner proposed corrective actions, referencing bylaws that allowed for audits, reimbursements, and potential penalties for non-compliance. Each suggestion was grounded in the documents that the board had once relied upon to justify authority, turning their own rules into instruments of accountability. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of tension and anticipation. Every movement observed, every reaction noted, and every inconsistency recorded. The board's once unquestioned control was now visibly fraying, replaced by an awareness that their actions or inactions were being held to a standard that could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed the formal confrontation, the HOA president and board members scrambled to respond, attempting to reconcile discrepancies, reissue approvals, and placate the growing unease among residents. Each step, however, was hampered by the homeowner's meticulous preparation, ensuring that any action taken was carefully documented, creating a permanent record of the board's previous negligence and their reactive measures. The homeowner's yard, a visual testament to compliance and diligence, became a symbol not only of personal effort, but of procedural integrity in contrast to the board's repeated failures. Flowers bloomed in precise arrangement, pathways glistened in the sunlight, and every hedge was trimmed with care. a tangible reminder of what adherence to rules and approvals should look like. The juxtaposition of this perfectly maintained property against the board's faltering authority amplified the impact of the confrontation, visually reinforcing the homeowner's position and undermining the president's credibility. By the end of the week, it was clear that the confrontation had achieved its initial purpose. The board was exposed, their evasions documented, and the community now aware, at least partially, of the mismanagement that had persisted unchecked. Chapter 5 would see the legal and procedural consequences begin to take shape as the homeowner leveraged the bylaws and documented evidence to compel action, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel the board's authority and reshape the neighborhood's governance entirely. With the confrontation behind him and the board visibly unsettled, the homeowner turned his attention to the next phase of the campaign, using the HOA bylaws not just as a shield, but as a weapon of legal leverage. He recognized that facts and exposure alone could only achieve so much. To force the board into compliance and recover the missing landscaping reimbursement, as well as address broader mismanagement, he needed to engage the rules as a binding framework. Over several nights, he meticulously reviewed the governing documents again, cross-referencing bylaws with state statutes, identifying clauses that empowered homeowners to demand audits, compel reimbursement, and even call for board accountability under specific procedural conditions. Every clause was cataloged and annotated with references to previous board failures, creating a comprehensive legal roadmap. Letters were drafted citing exact sections of the bylaws, pointing out violations, delays, and procedural errors, while also warning of the potential consequences of continued non-compliance. He understood that formality mattered. The language, citations, and tone had to be precise, authoritative, and indisputable. Simultaneously, he began gathering supporting evidence from neighbors, quietly collecting testimonies and records of similar incidents where reimbursements or approvals had been ignored. These accounts, once compiled, would reinforce the pattern of mismanagement and strengthen his position, demonstrating that the problem was systemic rather than isolated to his personal case. As the legal strategy solidified, he submitted a formal demand for reimbursement, attaching the full dossier, all supporting documents and references to the relevant bylaws. He requested not only the immediate payment owed for the landscaping, but also a formal accounting of recent board expenditures related to similar projects. The letter was delivered through certified channels, creating a permanent record of both submission and timing. The AA president's response arrived within days, but it was predictably inadequate, consisting of vague references to clerical errors and promises of review. Every promise, every attempt at delay was carefully documented by the homeowner, each entry reinforcing the narrative of avoidance and mismanagement. Recognizing that direct pressure alone might not compel action, he escalated strategically, invoking sections of the bylaws that allowed homeowners to request independent review and, if necessary, mediation or legal enforcement. The threat was implicit but clear. Continued evasion could trigger formal proceedings that would subject the board to scrutiny far beyond their usual comfort zone. Word of the ongoing legal maneuvering began to ripple through the neighborhood. Even homeowners who had been passive observers started paying attention, realizing that the dispute was no longer about a single landscaping project, but about the broader governance of their community. Conversations on porches, across fences, and at mailboxes increasingly referenced bylaws, board accountability, and the potential exposure of mismanagement. The homeowner recognized the strategic advantage of this awareness. Public scrutiny, even if informal, added pressure and increased the likelihood of compliance. While preparing for potential formal proceedings, he also began planning the physical demonstration of compliance, the landscaping itself. Each plant, hedge, and stone pathway became a statement, a visual argument that he had fulfilled his obligations under the bylaws, and that any refusal to reimburse was a breach of contract and governance. The juxtaposition of the flawless yard against the board's evasive responses created a powerful visual narrative, one that could not be ignored by residents or authorities. As the week progressed, small but telling cracks appeared in the board's coordination. Members communicated less frequently, emails were inconsistent, and attempts to coordinate meetings became increasingly awkward. The president, in particular, showed signs of strain, realizing that the homeowner's preparation and systematic approach left little room for maneuvering. In private, the homeowner anticipated potential objections and prepared counterarguments for each, documenting likely scenarios, procedural responses, and legal interpretations that could neutralize attempts at deflection. By the end of the week, the stage was set for a formal review, one that could involve mediation or legal intervention if the board continued to resist. Chapter 6 would see the homeowner transition from strategic preparation to execution, leveraging both bylaws and community awareness to force accountability, initiate broader financial review, and begin unraveling the board's authority in a way that would leave lasting consequences for the neighborhood and its leadership. The situation escalated swiftly as the homeowner transitioned from preparation to execution, taking deliberate steps to leverage both the bylaws and growing community awareness against the HOA board. Every interaction, every email, and every formal submission was meticulously documented, forming an unassailable record that tracked the board's failures and evasions with precision. He began by requesting an independent audit of all recent expenditures, citing multiple sections of the HOA bylaws that mandated transparency and accountability, and attaching his comprehensive dossier as evidence of repeated mismanagement. The request was formal, legally structured, and delivered through certified channels, ensuring that the board could not claim ignorance or miscommunication. Within days, the board responded, but their reply was inconsistent and incomplete, leaving multiple questions unanswered and failing to address the discrepancies highlighted in the homeowner's documentation. Rather than deterring him, these evasions strengthened his position. Each insufficient response became further proof of negligence, reinforcing the narrative that the board had failed in its fiduciary responsibilities and that the issue extended beyond a single landscaping reimbursement. Meanwhile, the homeowner began to strategically involve the broader community, carefully informing neighbors of procedural rights and their ability to demand accountability under the bylaws. Subtle communications through emails, flyers, and informal conversations illustrated patterns of mismanagement, and slowly, homeowners began to recognize the systemic nature of the problem. The growing awareness applied indirect pressure on the board as residents began asking questions, demanding explanations, and scrutinizing previously unquestioned expenditures. In response, the board grew increasingly defensive, attempting half-hearted attempts to reconcile individual complaints while avoiding full disclosure. Their internal communications revealed frustration and panic as they realized that the homeowner's meticulous preparation left little room for deception. The homeowner, anticipating these moves, maintained a calm and methodical approach, carefully noting every delay, every ambiguous statement, and every procedural misstep. His yard remained a physical testament to compliance and diligence, every hedge trimmed, every flower vibrant, every pathway precise, serving as a visual contrast to the board's evasive actions and a subtle symbol of legitimacy that resonated with the community. As the weeks progressed, small legal pressures began to mount. Letters from his attorney outlined potential consequences for continued non-compliance, citing sections of the governing documents and state statutes that could be invoked if the board failed to respond adequately. Each correspondence reinforced the seriousness of the situation, demonstrating that procedural failure would carry consequences far beyond internal reprimands or embarrassment. The homeowner also prepared for the eventuality of a public hearing or mediation session, creating a presentation that detailed financial discrepancies, misallocated funds, and repeated procedural violations, all backed by documented evidence and clear references to the bylaws. The board, sensing the increasing risk of exposure, attempted to preemptively address minor issues, issuing partial reimbursements or vague statements of intent. However, these token actions failed to resolve the larger discrepancies highlighted in the dossier, and the homeowner documented each partial compliance as evidence of reactive rather than proactive governance. With the community now quietly aligned and aware of potential mismanagement, the homeowner prepared for the next critical phase: a formal review or hearing that would compel the board to account for all irregularities under scrutiny, revealing systemic negligence and setting the stage for broader repercussions. Each day of delay by the board served only to strengthen his case, demonstrating a pattern of avoidance and reinforcing the necessity of legal and procedural enforcement. The homeowner's strategy combined patience, meticulous documentation, and careful escalation, leveraging both procedural rules and community awareness to create a position from which the board could no longer operate with impunity. By the end of this phase, the HOA president and board members were visibly strained, their authority increasingly questioned, and their ability to control the narrative diminishing by the day. Chapter 7 would mark the moment when the homeowner's preparation and community momentum converged in a decisive confrontation, exposing the full extent of the board's mismanagement and triggering consequences that would reverberate across the neighborhood and reshape its governance permanently. The tension that had been quietly building over weeks reached a critical tipping point as the homeowner, armed with an extensive dossier, meticulous records, and a deep understanding of the HOA bylaws, prepared to confront the board in a way that would leave no room for evasion. The neighborhood, long accustomed to a culture of unquestioned authority and subtle intimidation, now watched with quiet anticipation as the homeowner's careful planning began to take visible effect. Each interaction, each formal submission, and each documented discrepancy contributed to a growing awareness among residents that the HOA president and the board were not infallible and that their authority could be held accountable. The tipping point came in the form of a scheduled review meeting, formally requested by the homeowner under specific bylaws that granted residents the right to demand audits, explanations, and procedural compliance. The meeting was set in the community clubhouse, a space that had long been dominated by the board's authority, but now transformed into the stage for accountability and transparency. The homeowner arrived prepared, carrying binders filled with organized evidence, spreadsheets of financial discrepancies, photographs of completed projects, and annotated copies of bylaws. Each document had been cross-referenced, each claim backed by multiple layers of corroboration, leaving no ambiguity and no plausible deniability. As the board members entered the room, there was a visible shift in demeanor. The confidence and casual authority they had exhibited in prior meetings were replaced by hesitation, uncertainty, and subtle signs of apprehension. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that they were about to be held accountable in a setting that required both clarity and immediate response. The meeting began with a procedural review, where the homeowner outlined the purpose of the session: to assess compliance with bylaws, evaluate financial discrepancies, and ensure proper reimbursement and accountability for all community projects. Using clear, structured language, he presented each section of the dossier, highlighting the denial of his landscaping reimbursement as an entry point into broader mismanagement. As pages were turned and spreadsheets projected, the room's atmosphere became charged with tension. Residents who had been quietly observing from the periphery or through informal channels began to recognize patterns that mirrored their own experiences. Small murmurs of agreement, nods, and subtle exchanges conveyed the growing realization that the issues were systemic and that the homeowner's methodical approach had effectively exposed what many suspected but had been powerless to prove. The board attempted to respond, first with defensive claims and then with partial explanations, but each response was countered with precise evidence, clear references to governing documents, and documented timelines that demonstrated repeated procedural failures. Every deflection was noted, every vague statement recorded, reinforcing the homeowner's position and further eroding the board's credibility. The homeowner strategically highlighted not only his own case, but also the cumulative evidence of mismanagement across multiple projects, demonstrating patterns of favoritism, misallocation of funds, and repeated avoidance of responsibility. He juxtaposed his perfectly maintained landscaping against incomplete or poorly executed projects approved by the board, visually reinforcing the narrative of diligence versus negligence. By mid-meeting, the tension had shifted decisively. The board, once accustomed to unquestioned authority, now found themselves navigating a room of attentive residents and a homeowner armed with incontrovertible evidence. Each attempt to regain control or dismiss claims only underscored the depth of procedural violations, and the cumulative weight of evidence created an undeniable momentum toward accountability. Residents began to actively engage, asking questions and seeking clarification, further pressuring the board to respond transparently. The homeowner's approach was firm but methodical, balancing assertiveness with factual presentation, ensuring that each point was irrefutable and that the board had no opportunity to manipulate or delay the process. The board president's usual bluster was absent, replaced by subtle signs of strain. Hesitant gestures, careful phrasing, and moments of silence that betrayed internal panic. It became clear that the tipping point had been reached. The homeowner's preparation, community awareness, and strategic use of bylaws had created a situation in which the board's authority was no longer secure. The legal leverage he had cultivated over weeks of meticulous work now intersected with public scrutiny, creating a dual pressure that the board could neither dismiss nor evade. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, the homeowner presented his final demand: immediate reimbursement for his approved landscaping project, a complete audit of all recent expenditures, and a formal acknowledgement of procedural violations, all in accordance with the bylaws. He emphasized that failure to comply would trigger further legal action and potential removal of board members under established governance procedures. The board, facing undeniable evidence, community attention, and clear procedural authority, began to concede ground. The president acknowledged certain oversights. Partial reimbursements were approved, and the framework for a comprehensive audit was established. Residents witnessing the process began to regain confidence in their ability to hold leadership accountable, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from confrontation to cautious optimism. Outside the meeting, word of the tipping point spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Conversations shifted from speculation to validation as homeowners recognized that the persistent pattern of mismanagement had finally been exposed and addressed. The homeowner's yard, now symbolically prominent, became a visual marker of the successful application of bylaws and meticulous documentation to enforce accountability. By the end of the meeting, the stage was set for the final phase of transformation. Not only the resolution of his personal dispute, but the broader restructuring of HOA governance, ensuring transparency, accountability, and the prevention of future mismanagement. Chapter 8 would chronicle the aftermath of the tipping point, illustrating how the homeowner leveraged the momentum to reshape the neighborhood, restore confidence among residents, and permanently alter the board's authority, culminating in a comprehensive resolution that transformed both his yard and the community as a whole. In the aftermath of the pivotal meeting, the neighborhood entered a period of transformation that felt at once thrilling and unsettling, as though years of complacency and unquestioned authority had been suddenly ripped away, leaving residents to confront both the realities of mismanagement and the exhilarating possibility of reclaiming control. The homeowner, whose meticulous preparation and strategic use of HOA bylaws had precipitated the tipping point, now assumed a new role, not as an aggressor, but as a catalyst for systemic accountability, guiding the community through the complex and often tedious process of reform. The first visible change was the immediate reimbursement for the landscaping project, a symbolic yet tangible acknowledgement that the board could no longer ignore its obligation. Every flower, hedge, and stone pathway in the yard now stood as both a literal and figurative testament to diligence, compliance, and the power of procedural knowledge. Beyond the reimbursement, the board was compelled to commission a comprehensive audit of all recent expenditures, a process that uncovered further irregularities, including misallocated funds, unfulfilled contracts, and repeated instances where approvals had been granted on paper but never executed. These revelations, now backed by official documentation, fueled discussions among residents who began to recognize that the prior system of opaque governance had left them vulnerable to both negligence and manipulation. As the audit progressed, the homeowner took deliberate steps to ensure transparency, hosting open review sessions where residents could examine documents, ask questions, and understand the processes behind community expenditures. These sessions, once unimaginable under the former board, fostered a renewed sense of engagement and collective responsibility. The energy in the neighborhood shifted. Instead of fear or resignation, there was curiosity, vigilance, and a growing sense of empowerment. Homeowners began participating actively in meetings, volunteering for committees, and even auditing projects themselves, inspired by the clarity and effectiveness of the homeowner's methodical approach. While the board remained in place temporarily to maintain continuity, its authority had been fundamentally altered. Members who had once wielded unquestioned power were now accountable at every step, aware that any attempt to obscure decisions, delay approvals, or mismanage funds would be scrutinized meticulously by both the homeowner and the community. Their responses were no longer taken at face value. Transparency and accountability had become non-negotiable, and their previous methods of evasion were no longer viable. The homeowner's yard became a symbolic and practical anchor in this new era, demonstrating both the results of adherence to bylaws and the contrast between diligence and neglect. Neighbors visiting the property could see tangible proof of compliance, meticulous work, and the successful execution of approved projects, reinforcing the credibility of the broader campaign for accountability. Concurrently, the homeowner worked to formalize procedural reforms within the HOA, proposing amendments to the bylaws that reinforce transparency, established clear auditing processes, and created safeguards against unilateral decision-making by board members. Each proposed amendment was crafted to prevent recurrence of mismanagement and to empower residents with tools to oversee and enforce compliance. Community meetings began to reflect a culture of cooperation rather than confrontation, where debate was structured, evidence-based, and inclusive, replacing the previous environment of fear, opacity, and intimidation. Neighbors who had once felt powerless began to find their voices, contributing insights, suggesting improvements, and participating in project approvals with an informed perspective. The board, adapting to the new dynamic, shifted from authoritarian control to facilitation, learning to operate within the constraints imposed by both bylaws and vigilant residents. The homeowner's influence, though significant, was exercised carefully, emphasizing procedural correctness and fairness rather than personal gain or retribution. As the weeks and months passed, the neighborhood began to flourish under the new governance paradigm. Community projects were completed on time, budgets were transparent and verifiable, and residents were able to enjoy both the aesthetic and practical benefits of a cooperative environment. The landscaping that had triggered the initial conflict remained a point of pride, celebrated not only for its beauty but for its role as a catalyst for structural change. Beyond the material and procedural improvements, the social fabric of the community evolved. Trust, once eroded by years of opaque management, began to rebuild, and a sense of shared purpose emerged among residents who had participated in the process. Casual conversations across fences and sidewalks now included informed discussions about governance, project planning, and accountability, reflecting a new culture of engagement. The HOA president, whose authority had been challenged and constrained, adapted reluctantly but visibly to the new expectations, their former dominance tempered by procedural oversight and community scrutiny. Other board members followed suit, understanding that compliance was no longer optional and that deviation would be noticed, documented, and addressed. The homeowner, while recognized for initiating the transformation, maintained a measured presence, focusing on ensuring that the principles of transparency, accountability, and procedural fairness became embedded within the neighborhood's governance culture rather than remaining tied to any single individual. By the conclusion of the reform process, the neighborhood had not only recovered from years of mismanagement, but had established a durable system designed to prevent future abuses of authority. Every resident, from longtime homeowners to recent arrivals, could observe the tangible benefits of active engagement, proper oversight, and adherence to clearly defined bylaws. The transformation extended beyond aesthetics or individual projects, embedding itself in the community's identity and collective expectations. The landscaping that had triggered the dispute now symbolized resilience, procedural mastery, and the power of a single determined individual to catalyze systemic change. Flowers, hedges, and pathways that had once been mere elements of a yard now stood as enduring reminders that diligence, documentation, and strategic use of rules could reshape governance, restore trust, and empower an entire neighborhood. In reflecting on the journey, it became clear that the victory was multidimensional. The homeowner had secured reimbursement, compelled accountability, reformed procedural oversight, and fostered a culture of transparency and empowerment that would endure long after the immediate dispute had been resolved. Residents could now rely on both formal mechanisms and collective vigilance to ensure responsible governance, creating a precedent for accountability that would influence future boards and projects indefinitely. And as the sun set over the perfectly landscaped yard, the vibrant colors of flowers and meticulously laid stone paths gleaming in the fading light, the homeowner stood quietly, understanding that the resolution was more than a personal victory. It was the culmination of careful strategy, methodical research, community engagement, and the disciplined application of bylaws, a legacy of accountability that had permanently altered the neighborhood's governance and set a new standard for transparency, fairness, and civic responsibility. The neighborhood, once dominated by evasive authority, had been transformed into a thriving, participatory, and empowered community, and the legal and procedural unraveling that had begun with a denied landscaping reimbursement had now reached its ultimate conclusion, leaving a lasting impact that would be remembered for years to come.